Welcome. We're going to explore here in this session, just to make sure you're in the right session that you intended to be in. My name is Dr. Paul Jehle, and we are looking at the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Though it's an extremely fundamental question, ought to be very simple. This kind of a topic, and most of the topics you hear at seminars like this, ought to be very, very simple. But they are not simple any longer because of the confusion that we live in our day to day. And there has been a tremendous confusion in this area. And something as simple as the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, two of our founding documents, they're two sides of the same coin. They're inseparable. They're twins. They're sister documents. You phrase it in many ways. And yet today, they are completely divorced in most people's minds. In fact, the divorce between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and what would have been even more preposterous, would have been actually going back in time, which we're going to do. We walk back a little bit in the 1700s and suggest such an idea, that the charter of a nation is divorced from its bylaws. And you would have an immense confusion on people's faces. How could that possibly be? So I'm going to kind of break this down into several key points to make it as simple as possible for you. I'll use some background information to deal with this. But right now, I want to just make this one point that I'm going to start off with and walk up a little bit in history, is a simple fact that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, by their very nature in law and their very nature in common law, are inseparable. That they cannot be separated, or if you do separate them, you violate the nature of both. And looking at this for a moment, we could look at it and say, gee, they're two sides of the same coin. But before we go back and try to substantiate even that simple statement, let's go back and let's begin toward the beginning. And a lot of people, when you would talk about the American Revolution, will talk about this simple fact, that what was the American Revolution all about? And someone would say, yes, the defense of rights and the inherent defense of the God-given rights that the colonists felt they had. But often when we look at the documents of the American Revolution, people make the serious mistake by thinking that the Declaration of Independence was the beginning document. And that's not true. That was the culminating document of independence, but it was not the beginning document. In fact, if we were to go back, we'd recognize several things, and I'm just going to highlight a few of them to underscore this. One of the first things that we'd have to go back and look at was the beginning of the Continental Congress. Now, to give you just a basic understanding of how the colonists viewed themselves and how the British constitutions, because they had no one constitution, but the British constitutions viewed the colonies as well. See, every one of the colonies, when they were formed under English law and under English rights. Which meant when the colonies came over here and they began their foundations, they each actually constructed their own mini parliament. So when the English colonies came over here, one fundamental right of Englishmen, it was understood, is they would govern themselves through self-government. Having representatives, they elected themselves. Now remember, in England, people were not elected, land was represented rather. People were not represented, land was represented. So it was very different than they began to do over here by electing representatives of population. But still, you had this parliament, so every colony, all 13 colonies by the time of the American Revolution, had their own parliaments. They had their own assemblies, they were called. They could govern themselves. So any tax issue, if King George wanted to have a tax in the colonies to pay for the French and Indian War rather than the 1750s, he would request a tax. But of course, requesting a tax is far different than enforcing a tax. He would request the tax, but who would be responsible for debating such a tax? It'd be the local assemblies of those parliaments, or those parliaments of the local colonies. And when they would begin to come and enact that constitutional tax, they would be taxing themselves. What kept them linked with England was they had the same king, the same ultimate executive. The governors of all the colonies were ultimately answerable to the king, but the salaries of the governors were paid by the people in the colonies. That was really critical because they did not want the governor to be out of touch with that colony. And so you had this mixture. You had the king who was the one king of all 13 colonies. So every colony had the same king. But did every colony have the same parliament? No, they all had their individual, distinct parliaments. And so why did we get the Continental Congress, this new government that was instituted by the colonies? And that's because during what we call the 10-year constitutional debate period, from about 1765 to 1774, what we call just about 10 years, the constitutional debate period, they were debating something. Since 1660, there had been on the books in England many laws which were forcing monopoly of English trade with the colonies. But those laws were never enforced. An ocean in between had made it very difficult for England in any way to control the colonies in the area of trade. Thus, you had laws on the books that were ignored by the colonies because they felt they were unconstitutional by the very charters that England had given them. Now notice, this is very critical. In order for a colony to be legitimate as part of England, it had to have a charter. A charter simply defined the colony's existence and defined the origin of their law and their rights. So all the charters of the colonies declared that they had the same rights as anyone had in England. And by implication, they had natural rights, which were, and sometimes by explicit consent, they had natural rights. That meant their rights were unalienable. They came from God. That's what a natural right was. You got it by area of birth. Now, when you had that natural right, that was the charter. That said, that's where your laws were not to be repugnant to the nation of England. Your laws then, and your definition, where they came from, what the source of law was. But a charter alone did not set up a government. A charter authorized you to set up a government. Then you would set up a government, your colonial constitution. The colonial constitution was, in effect, the bylaws, the due process by which you carried out the authority that was given to you in the charter. So these two documents were called two sides of the same coin. That's, in effect, how Jamestown was founded and how the Pilgrims were founded. Now, Jamestown was an extension of England in Virginia, extension of the same kind of government with the same kind of rights, but they had a charter. That charter came out of 1606, which was the specific charter of King James, which allowed for colonies to be started over here in what we call the New World, or the Western civilization, Western Hemisphere. When that began to take place, and Jamestown was started, that charter of 1606 gave them permission. But then they set up a government, and of course by 1619, Jamestown had a legislative assembly. The common law had come to Virginia, and the common law had come as a result of English tradition, dating all the way back to the Ten Commandments and the Liber ex lege Moysi, which had come the 1st and 2nd centuries during the Celts, and the Celtic Christianity, which had permeated the British Isles and become the foundation of common law, and of course had become the foundation of King Alfred's Code of Laws by 890 AD. So this long tradition of having a charter which gave you permission to have a government, that defined your authority, it defined the source of your law, it defined the source of your rights. Then you had the bylaws, the government, which we call today due process. What is the process by which the rights which were defined in the charter get protected? Does it make common sense? It's common sense and it's logic in law that just to say your rights are going to be protected is not enough. How are they going to be protected? By what means are your rights going to be protected? And what defense do you have against a runaway government if it doesn't protect your rights? Well, this is the bylaws and the charter. Now, of course, with the Pilgrims in 1620, it was a little different because when the Pilgrims came, they had separated from the Church of England. They had separated from the nation. The Pilgrims were told they couldn't leave and they couldn't stay. Fairly difficult predicament. And so therefore, the Pilgrims, when they left, in essence, they seceded from England. Now, you secede also with a charter. They got a charter. And they were going to set up a government not repugnant to the laws of England, but in essence, because of the way they left and the fact that they were in Holland over in Holland for 12 years before they actually came here, but were still coming under the 1606 charter that had already been given for the planting. It was a bit difficult, but a charter was issued to the Pilgrims. 1617, 1618. And that charter gave them permission again to come and do what? What was the first thing they're going to have to do? Set up a government, a bylaw of some kind. Now, when they were blown off course, they actually did a new charter called the Mayflower Compact. That was not a constitution. It was a charter. It's the first step. It's the cornerstone of a constitution. The Mayflower Compact, when they set that Mayflower Compact up, it was a charter saying it defined their rights as being God-given. It defined the power flow from God to the people, then to the king. And it defined that. But in 1636, the Pilgrims formed a constitution. That became the bylaws. That was the due process by which those rights were protected. So if you follow that pattern of thinking, which was very common in the 1600s, very common in the 1700s, it's not a shock. It wouldn't be a shock for us to recognize that the same kind of mentality in law would come about. But with some twists that took place in the 1700s, a little more difficult, because you recognize during that constitutional debate period for 9 years, 10 years, the difficulty was, as England began to enforce its tyrannical laws, particularly mercantilism and its monopoly over the colonies, that they should not buy anything except from England. For instance, the colonies were now producing their own wool. So what does England do? It passes the Woolen Act. The Woolen Act says it's illegal to produce your own wool. You have to buy it from England. And the colonies produced their own hats. Guess what you got out of England? The Hat Act. And the Hat Act was a monopoly saying you had to buy your hats from England. The colonies produced their own molasses. The Molasses Act comes out of England saying, no, you can't produce your own molasses from the trees up here. And in New England, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to buy it from England. Well, of course, those laws and those acts between 1660 and 1760 were never enforced. It was too difficult, too financially impossible to send ships from England over to the colonies and enforce monopoly through really just the other word of tyranny and crack down. Until 1760. When King George III comes to the throne, he says, I'm going to make all those dormant laws active. Now, how many of you know right now, not to get really off the subject because we won't really fine-tune this and get into this, but if the United States government itself decided to enforce all the laws that are really on the books, that Federal Register, which you couldn't read if you started today till the day you died, it's too big, that all of those things, that every American is in violation of not the law, but the shadow law of bureaucracy. And so it has become absolutely enormous. But if they begin to be enforced, that which you have ignored before becomes a flea-biting. Worse, if it's enforced by the sword, it becomes a major problem. And that's what happened in 1760. So by 1765, when the Stamp Act takes place, the colonies begin to reason with this and say, wait a minute, what are they doing passing a Stamp Act in Parliament that just usurped our constitutional government? Because we have our own parliaments, right? What's Parliament enacting a tax overriding the parliaments of the colonies? This violates the very charter of Virginia, the very charter of Massachusetts, the very charter of Maryland, the charter of Delaware. This violates our charters. We're Englishmen. We can govern ourselves. We govern ourselves by our own representatives. Our own parliaments must pass those taxes. And what did they keep saying all the way through this time? And of course, we know the leader of the colonies in the 1760s in those areas was Virginia. And in Williamsburg, when they would reason with this, they kept continually coming back. Okay, what if a government goes berserk? What if a government gets so intoxicated with its own power that it no longer even recognizes the written Constitution it says defines its own powers? Can you imagine such a situation to ever take place? What if a government actually ignored the very written law that is in that government? What recourse do you have? How can you possibly recover your ancient rights, your primitive principles? Where do you go? Is it just left to the sword? Is the only answer just to deal with force? Or what can you possibly do? Well, over and over again, the colonies began to go back to the original. And the original were the laws of nature and of nature's God. That there is a law above Great Britain. There is a law that's bigger, wider, and more supreme than King George. And those laws define our natural rights that preceded the existence of a charter or a government. Now this becomes very important because the very charters they went back to deal with defined it. Now you see, going back to 1606, and the reason I do this is because this is the root of our government. This is why the argument was so clear. This is why the Declaration and the Articles of Confederation initially were two sides of the same coin. In fact, they were both created with the same motion in the Continental Congress at the same time. And you see, when this takes place, the idea of having a charter and the idea of having a bylaws, two sides of the same coin, the definition of where your rights come from, were very clear because in 1606, even though King James did not like the Puritans, did not like the Pilgrims, did not like anybody who was coming over here, didn't like actually anybody other than himself, first king to coronate himself. I mean, King James was a bit heady, high-minded. I mean, he actually said, "I am the voice of the Holy Ghost for the nation of England." It's scary. It's kind of scary because he would then articulate these kinds of statements, and he was well trained. He was trained as a theologian. He was trained, but he wasn't living like one. And this was a very, very difficult situation for the colonists at the time because he was looked to as a child of the Reformation. Actually, he was schooled under the Reformation, though he remembers as a child he didn't like John Knox too well, for good reason. But the point is that he recognized that you have this continuum that takes place. By the time now that King James is there, initially, there were so many Christian statesmen in the Parliament at the time that they got King James to put his seal on a document that said the colonies would be coming for a Christian mission and they would have unalienable rights. They would have rights that were natural rights. So in other words, now notice how the irony of this. King James thinks, because he's the coiner of the phrase, divine right of kings, King James thinks all rights come from the crown. Well, come from him. Specifically, and they come out to people from the crown. And yet, he puts his stamp of approval to a charter in 1606 that say the rights are going on the boat with the people. They're not staying in the crown. They go with the people. In fact, it's articulated clearly in Jamestown, articulated clearly in Plymouth, that they understood their natural rights were not in the crown. They were in God. They were God-given, not government-granted, and therefore, the crown could not disturb them nor change them. And what does Patrick Henry do? When he gives his famous speech in Williamsburg, at the time in 1774, as the Continental Congress is going to start, it's Patrick Henry that stands up and says, "Listen, folks, our initial original rights are articulated in the Charter of 1606. And he goes back and he invokes the natural rights of the colonists because those natural rights are defined in their charter, you see. And because of that, in 1774, you find these words, and this is the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. Now, there was a well-known theory at the time. It came from John Calvin and his Institutes of the Christian Religion. And John Calvin had said simply this, that if you have higher magistrates that no longer follow the covenantal law by which they're under, you can resist them. You can't resist them directly in revolution from the people and just overthrow those higher magistrates. You have to elect lower magistrates, and you have to act under the law in resisting the abuse of law. You cannot simply act as a direct rebel and overthrow law. That's unlawful. You'll never get the approval of God, and you'll just end up having more rebellion. And if you just rebel against the problems that you have, you'll get a worse government in the end. So what you need to do is you have the lower magistrate resist the higher magistrate rather than the people, because the idea is this: you convince the higher magistrate that you can submit to law, that this is not an anarchy, this is a lawful resistance of tyranny, because the definition of a tyrant is a person who rules outside their stated jurisdiction. A tyrant is not someone who simply wields a sword and kills people. A tyrant is one who abuses their authority and actually tries to rule outside their jurisdiction consistently. As the Declaration says, a long train of abuses. It's not an accident. Oops, forgot. This is a long train of abuses. So in 1774, we find these words in the Declaration Resolves, because the Continental Congress was the lower magistrate that the colonists elected in order to resist the higher magistrate coming from England, the Parliament, and the King, which was ruling outside its jurisdiction. So they were going to do it lawfully. And they say this phrase, the inhabitants of the English colonies in North America, by the immutable laws of nature and the principles of the English Constitution and the several charters and compacts, have the following rights. Notice the language. Very clear. We have our natural rights. That comes from God the Creator. That's what the phrase means. We have our natural rights and also our own charters that have been written and our own compacts, which are very clear and tell us we have these rights. Now, as that resistance continued, the Second Continental Congress came and was formed. And this one's still seeking reconciliation. Still seeking reconciliation in 1774 and 1775. And when they did this, in the second one, they recognized that the same kind of rights. In fact, they would make it very clear in July 6, 1775, they called it this, but they went one step further, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Now, by the way, this document in 1775 is what we call the Declaration of War by the colonists upon England. They declared that they would defend their rights to the death if necessary with arms because England refused to recognize those rights. Now, this was July 6, 1775. What they did not know is it being debated in Parliament at almost the same time. Because remember, though something may take place, I often deal with this with students, just because a document's dated July 6, 1775, and then the next document we examine is August 23, 1775, they assume today that everyone knew about both documents. Not so. It'd be 3 months before you realize what happened in July. So here's something overlapping. And here's what's overlapping. The king, August 23, 1775, King George III declares all the colonies in rebellion and severs his relationship with them. So he says, you are no longer English colonies. You are rebels. Now, this document's not well known. This document's not taught in textbooks. Because people like to repudiate the Declaration of Independence by saying, people just didn't like paying taxes. So they just wrote a Declaration of Independence and they took up the sword and they just attacked England when England came. All England was trying to do was just restore order to these rebellious colonies that were in anarchy. I've heard that said. My students it's kind of funny because when I take them on field trips and study trips, if we get a tour guide that says that, of course, all eyes go right on me. As soon as the tour guide says they were just a bunch of rebels and didn't know what they were doing. And of course, we asked some questions very politely and nicely. And most tour guides, to their defense, just simply memorized the thing that they were given to memorize. But the point is, this document, August 23rd, is a document that's very significant because the king severs that. The colonies said, if you continue to attack us, we are issuing a declaration of war. We're issuing a statement that says we will defend our rights. However, we still are looking for reconciliation if that's possible. Now, there are still many colonists who weren't ready for independence. But you have to recognize, after August 23rd, 1775, you must recognize that that document wasn't even in the colonies till December or January of 1775, January of 1776. So it's around January of 1776 that all of the members of the Continental Congress become aware that King George has severed his relationship with the colonies. In other words, the aggressive act of severance was not on the colony side. It was on England's side. And said, you're all a bunch of rebels. And you no longer have governments. And he dissolved all their assemblies. He said, all your parliaments do not exist. Well, that's a little easier said than done. That's nice. And there's lots of things we call the magic wand of tyrannical government. Poof, you just do not exist. Well, not so. In fact, the colonists then realized all their assemblies were no longer English assemblies. They were now American assemblies. What authority did they have to elect a Continental Congress that they would have? Now, first, they had the authority to resist tyranny. Second of all, now they had the authority coming from the fact that if they got severed from the nation of England, what were they? Were they 13 independent colonies floating around in the ocean someplace? Did they have any authority whatsoever? Was all their authority drawn from the crown? Was all of it drawn from the king? No. They said, we go back to the natural rights of every human being as a creation of God, and we claim our natural rights so we can draw up our own charter. We now are not going to be out of existence just because King George says that. We are now going to have our own charter. And that's, of course, the origin of the Declaration of Independence. On May 10, 1776, the Continental Congress said this to all the colonies. Interesting phrase in its statement. On May 10, 1776, the Continental Congress, this is in America now, said this, that it be recommended to the respective assemblies and conventions of the United Colonies, where no government sufficient to the exigencies of their affairs hath been hitherto established, to adopt such government as shall, in the opinion of the representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular, and America in general. So basically they were saying this in May. This is prior to the Declaration of Independence. Hey, listen, folks, we have no covering from England. We are no longer an extension of England. They've severed that tie. You already have your charters. You already have your permission for existence. Now, form your own bylaws. Form your own government that will protect those rights as best as you see fit individually. This was a call for every colony to have their own individual parliament, now not as an extension from England. It wasn't an extension from the English Parliament, but not just because you're Englishmen, now because you're claiming it directly from the natural rights you have from God. Now form your own constitutions. Prior to 1776 and July 4, every colony had its own constitution, its own draft, its own area. Now, that Constitution wasn't fully ratified as a separate state until after the Declaration of Independence and in specific order, but they recognized their need to do this. So, when you have in the same actual motion that is given on the floor, for instance, if you look at this, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to read certain sections of it very quickly here that would be probably very familiar to you, we could say the following, that this Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, our first national constitution, were actually brought forth in the same breath. In fact, June 7, 1776, this is the first, Richard Henry Lee brings forth the proposition. This is what he says. He brings forth this motion. I move that the colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. So in the very same motion, a charter for the definition of the United States of America was drafted. In the very same motion, the Articles of Confederation, the constitutional bylaws that would protect that charter, were there. Could anything be clearer than the two were two sides of the same coin? Drafted in the same motion, understood for the same purpose. You know, we need a united declaration of independence that every colony now, we need to tell the world, because King George won't tell the world what he did August 23rd. He's not going to tell them that he severed the relationship with the colonies. We're going to tell the whole world why we are independent and have a right, ought to be independent. We're going to reclaim our natural charter as human beings under the creation of God, and we're going to claim that as that charter, but also we don't just need a charter. What do we need? We need a set of bylaws to protect it, and we're going to have a confederation. And so they do this. Now, it's interesting that we could then have a couple of subpoints. First of all, the Declaration of Independence, as a long pattern that precedes it, from all the English colonies that come here, and it simply says this: a colony, a group of people, can sever its relationship to its former government lawfully. If you cannot secede lawfully, then what hope is there other than force? You can secede. This was the declaration. A charter says, you know what? You can do this. Now, England didn't say this, because did England accept the secession of the colonies? No. And what did it do to prove it? No legal arguments, just arguments by force. And they sent the troops in to say, even though we have no relationship with you anymore, even though you are now abandoned children, you have no parent, your father has disowned you, you are cut off, can't leave. Because you have certain financial benefits to the parent, and we want your taxes, but we don't want your constitutional arguments. So they send down the troops. And of course, the Declaration of Independence was critical in this regard because remember, during this whole debate period in 1775 and 1776, battles are going on. We've got Lexington, Concord, Salem. You've got the stores. You've got even before that, a year before that in Williamsburg. You've got all kinds of conflict taking place in the colonies already. So when that Continental Congress meets in 1775, it has work to do. But in 1776, the third year of the Continental Congress, just before, a committee was formed on June 12, 5 days after that motion was made, consisting of one member from every one of the 13 colonies to draft a confederation, a set of bylaws. It was not fully ratified by all 13 colonies, though it was in effect once the majority had ratified it. But it was not in effect. They had to have unanimous decisions to deal with it. It was not in full effect till 1781. Actually, the year that there would be the surrender down in Virginia of the American Revolution, though we know troops were not even dismantled till 1783. But the idea is, you had this during the entire time of the American Revolution. You had a bylaw and a confederation being formed as a compact of the various states. So you could have a secession. Second, any colony has a separate and equal station, a right to independence from the laws of nature and of nature's God. There has to be some way for you to reclaim that. Third, in essence, the Declaration was a call for a set of bylaws. A set of bylaws that would be enacted. That first set of bylaws was the Articles of Confederation. Now when we have the Articles of Confederation and they begin to operate, the Articles, they were well named. It was a confederated government. A confederated government is a loose compact of states and leaves all the states in their complete and existing sovereignty except for the very specific areas they yield to the federal head. And thus it was a compact of states. That compact of states governed during the American Revolution. The compact of states was seen by many not to have enough powers to be able to unite the complete colonies. Thus, what ended up happening, and you know the story then, several years later after the tumultuous 1780s, there was a call for a new constitutional convention. And that new constitutional convention called people into Philadelphia in May of 1787. The delegates who came to that convention had specific instructions to amend the Articles of Confederation, but not to rewrite a new charter. In fact, the idea was that you were going to amend the Articles of Confederation, and whatever you came out with would replace the Articles, but not replace what? The charter. The charter was not replaced. In fact, the Constitution became the more perfect union of the Articles of Confederation, but did not in any way repudiate the Declaration of Independence. It still rested on it, just to make sure everybody understood that, because all the debates covered most of the bases. It's nice to look back more than 200 years now, and there are a few things I wish they debated at the Constitutional Convention more thoroughly and everything else, but I've got the benefit of a lot of years. But the idea would be simply this. When that took place, and that new set of bylaws, it at no time repudiated the Declaration of Independence. And to make sure of that, the colonists put this at the end of the Constitution. Done in convention, by the unanimous consent of the states present, 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States, the 12th. Oh, that's just rhetoric, isn't it? That's not significant. It's very significant. Because it dated the Constitution, and it linked it inseparably with what? The Declaration of Independence. In other words, this is in the 12th year of the independence of America. We're not forgetting our charter. The Constitution of the United States in 1787 did not birth a new nation. It changed the bylaws. It amended the bylaws. And some people who are negative about the increased powers, and again, we have hindsight with us. You know, if Patrick Henry smelled a rat, didn't go to the Constitutional Convention, we could go on, and just about all of his warnings have proven him to be better than we thought. But the point is, or I never had a doubt about Patrick Henry, but I have advantage of the years. But dealing with this, you look back and you realize the Constitution of the United States rested squarely on the Declaration as much as the Articles of Confederation rested on the Declaration. Different set of bylaws, different dealings with this. And now we have to ask ourselves a question. This inseparable link, this lawful link between charters and bylaws, this link between what defines your rights and defines the source of your law, because you have no other foundation to appeal from. Remember, the British Constitution left no recourse. Very, very scattered. The only thing at the time of the Boston Tea Party that was written in common law in England said if you wanted to resist an unjust tax, there was no lawful way to appeal a tax in England on the English Constitution. However, this was in common law. What you had to do was you had to, first of all, make sure that whatever commodity you didn't want to pay the tax on stayed in port for 30 days. You had to make sure, or 20 days, that was, it did not leave. You had to give the owner the chance to what? Leave with his property and not go bankrupt. Second, you had to guard it. You could not let anyone steal it. Nobody could, if you didn't want to pay the tax, you can't take the commodity. You leave it there. It's tainted with tax. So you leave it there. After that, it's liable for seizure. After those 20 days, liable for seizure. And what you have to do is you have to make a public demonstration in public about the tax that you gave the 20 days notice, and then you have to destroy every bit of the commodity. Nobody can take any. Now the question is, did the colonists follow lawful procedure? They did. They actually left it in port exactly 20 days to the hour. And when Sam Adams stood up in the Old South Church, he said, this meeting could do nothing more to save our country. The public demonstration began. Most people believe it was Paul Revere, probably was, leading the pack. He was always where danger was greatest. And down he went to the street. And what did they do? They had a guard around those ships 24 hours a day. And they actually destroyed every bit of tea as common law would recognize. None of it was landed. Nobody could take any. Nobody could get it without the commodity. The Tory governor, Hutchinson, the one who hated the colonists, who wrote a history of New England and a history of the Boston Tea Party, he stated, I do believe, and you can just hear the monotone voice in the writings, I do believe they have acted in every way constitutional. Like, I was hoping to catch them in some way. Well, why did that happen? Because the colonists were very astute as to the lawful means by which you resist. Unlike today's textbook that simply say, people loved tea, they were greedy, didn't want to pay the tax, started a riot, and stole it all. No, obviously not historically accurate if such an exaggeration was to be made. Well, let me ask you this question then. All right, was this link just lost in the 1700s? No, well, very soon after, this link became very, very clear. In the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798, when they felt the federal government was going off base and John Adams was in the White House and got upset with everybody's cartoons about him and everything else, he issued an executive order from the White House. Now, he didn't mean by the executive order what the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and his good buddies, who weren't his good buddies at the time, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote them. But it's interesting, not so much why they wrote it, though it was very important on the First Amendment and everything else, about the fact that you could speak against the government and against individuals without being liable. The issue came down to this. They'd say, where do they rest their case in these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions against the national government? And it built a movement in the North. Most people don't realize it was the northern colonies that started the move for secession in 1810. Because in 1810, they were so upset with Thomas Jefferson's embargo from England to stop them from impressing American soldiers that they decided that the New England states felt they were going to lose the most, and they were threatened secession. But in the Hartford Convention of 1811, when they threatened to secede from the Union, it's interesting to note that during that time, they were threatening it, and they were saying the following. Well, you see, we can leave the Union because the United States Constitution brings us a confederated government. Now, the South said, you can't leave the Union. The government's consolidated. That exact argument would be inversed 20 years from then. But the idea would be, the North said, we can leave because the Constitution is a confederated document. The South said, no, it's consolidated. Well, by 1830, it had been reversed. And in 1830, you might know that the famous debate between Daniel Webster and Robert Haines took place in Washington, D.C. on the nature of the Constitution and secession. Why do I say this? Because this was going to be a test. Was there a link between the Constitution and the Declaration? Because when you are in a debating battle, how are you going to know exactly where your rights come from if there's no declaration? Because the Constitution doesn't declare it. And therefore, if you read the Constitution separate from the Declaration, your rights come from government. If you read the Constitution separate from the Declaration, you can read just about anything into it because the premises on which the Constitution rests are in the Declaration. In fact, the preamble to the Constitution is a summary of the Declaration. It's a summary of the principles that are already there. It's a link between the two documents in such a way that it should be inseparable. Well, in 1830, I think this is very interesting because James Madison was up there in years, but he's the architect of the Constitution. He had something to say about this debate. Because, you might know this, Daniel Webster said the Constitution was a consolidated government, therefore nobody could secede. It was like a marriage. And since God hates divorce, the South can't leave the Union. That's a very simple. I'm not doing justice to Daniel Webster, and he's from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and that's okay. But still, Daniel Webster was in error. The government was not a consolidated government, meaning there are no state rights. Now, he wouldn't say there were no state rights, but the problem is, Robert Haines got up in 1830 in this big debate. People would have paid admission for this. This was the Super Bowl of 1830. And they came, and Robert Haines said, no, it's a confederated document. Any one state can nullify any act of Congress and leave the Union if it wishes over any issue. Because we came in under a confederated idea, we can leave under a confederated idea. Now, both ideas were extremes. Dear old James Madison, he wrote a letter to both of them. And this is what he said. And I think it's important because I think you need to see that this was not something that's just high and mighty or we just pull out of thin air here. We're not pulling out and saying the Declaration and the Constitution are inseparable just because we'd like it to be so. This is something well established in history. This is his letter, August 28, 1830, and his letter is reference to Robert Haines, but of course it was addressing that debate with Daniel Webster as well. In order to understand, this is quoting James Madison, the true character of the Constitution of the United States, the error not uncommon must be avoided of viewing it through the medium of either a consolidated government or of a confederated government, while it is neither the one nor the other, but a mixture of both. And having in no model the similitudes and analogies applicable to other systems of government, it must, more than any other, be its own interpreter according to its text and the facts of the case. From these it will be seen that the characteristic peculiarities of the constitutions are the mode of its formation, the division of its supreme powers of government between states in their united capacity and states in their individual capacities. Now, this was the genius of the Constitution in many ways. It provided a more stable union, so one state can't say, I'm taking my toys and going home over any issue in Congress. Well, you wouldn't have a union longer than a year, maybe not even a month. On the other hand, it is not so consolidated that you can't get out. So Madison is saying, look, it's a mixture of both. There are two kinds of things. You have the states in their united capacity that yield power to the national government, and you have states in their individual capacities that retain all of the rights not expressly given to the federal government. And you have that interlocking of both in such a way that in common law, the way into a covenant is the way out of the covenant. And the way into the covenant was not just by a vote of the state legislature, but also by a vote of the Congress. Therefore, you had an interlocking area. Robert E. Lee understood this. That's why he opposed the Virginia secession, though he would fight for the defense of Virginia, because the North had no right to invade a state either constitutionally. He would defend those rights, but also recognize secession by merely a vote of the state legislature was not fully constitutional either. This idea of an interlocking government was critical, but that didn't answer the whole question. James Madison knew the slavery issue, and particularly the constitutional issue, which was the real issue, that was debated heavily, though slavery was certainly one of the main events caught up in that. He had this to say. Now here's the most important part of the letter for our discussion. I tell you, this letter is worth the book I'm quoting it from, but this is The Education of James Madison by Mary Elaine Swanson, one of the most articulate books. If you want to know the mind of the architect of the Constitution, James Madison, I highly recommend it. It's on our book table at Plymouth Rock Foundation. But the idea is, this is phenomenal. I'll tell you right now, to me, I learned a few things by going through The Education of James Madison. Very well done. We've modeled in our own academy some of the curriculum from how James Madison was taught. But I'll tell you, this letter at the back is a gem. And listen to what he says. In the event of a failure, now think of this. Your mind is going to go this way. Okay, sounds good. But what if every constitutional means is tried? You know what? And James Madison says this. in the failure of every constitutional resort, an accumulation of usurpations and abuses rendering passive obedience and non-resistance a greater evil than resistance and revolution, there can remain but only one resort, the last of all, a careful appeal from the canceled obligations of the Constitutional Compact to the original rights and the law of self-preservation. This is the ultima ratio under every government, whether consolidated, confederated, or a compound of both, and it cannot be doubted that a single member of the Union, in the extremity supposed, but in that only, would have a right, as an extra and ultra-constitutional right, to make this appeal. What does Madison say? Ultimately, you've got to go back to the original natural rights. Or in other words, you'll never solve this problem without the Declaration. You'll never solve it, and this was the problem. This was not heeded. And folks, the Civil War could have been avoided. And why? Because, you know, in the 1860s, when the Civil War erupted, the South was firmly entrenched. The books had been written. The Southern historians had come to their mark and said, the Constitution is confederated. Anybody can leave anytime it wants. In the North, it had become established. The Constitution is consolidated. Nobody can leave. Even Lincoln had said, during that time, he said, listen, nobody, all the states had seceded now, he became president, and he said, by the way, nobody has left. Nobody has left. Therefore, they're still our brethren, and they can all come back because they haven't left. Well, neither of those arguments solves the issue. The one thing Lincoln had going for him, think about it, very profound, is in the Gettysburg Address. When he said 77 years ago the nation came into being, what was he dating it to? 1776. The Declaration of Independence. The major flaw. Now, I've studied both, and I study and teach the Confederated Constitution of the Confederate States, and I see improvements that they made over the federal government and the Constitution. However, one major flaw is they do not date, nor do they reference as the foundation, the Declaration of Independence. And one of the reasons for that is you can't maintain the institution of slavery and say all men are created equal. You can't do that. And that which becomes so important during this during this battle. This seminar is not about the Civil War. It's a tremendous discussion. It has never truly been discussed, probably in its fullest way that we should. But the point is this. Most important for you to recognize is the architect of the Constitution, years later, shouts, as it were, through the clouds and says, remember, guys, the Constitution, in and of itself, without the Declaration, you will not interpret properly. I think that's profound. I think that's very, very important. Now, how do we do this? Well, think about this for a moment before I make a couple of other key points. Do you think there's been any effect today? I mean, do you really think there's any modern effect today of the, in essence, divorce of the Constitution from the Declaration? Today, now more than 100 years after the last clarion call of this, the Declaration of Independence is hardly referenced in any Supreme Court decision. It's hardly referenced in anyone debating a bill. In other words, something violated with this. That's correct. And so you look at this and you say, wait a second now, if this divorce today, what might it mean? Well, do you know one of the key things? You remove the Declaration, and rights are no longer unalienable and given by the Creator. What's your only other option? Government. And if government gives rights, government can take them away, but worse, government can define them without your notice. Rights get redefined. Wait a minute, when did that word get that definition? Well, equivocation is part of bureaucracy. I mean, that word just changed. No, it didn't change. Words can change meaning. Definitions and source of laws can change. No accountability to a higher law other than the Constitution itself if the Declaration is removed. When the Declaration is there, there is an appeal to a much higher law than the Supreme Court of the United States. And that's why, even when the Declaration was written, the Declaration was a declaration of position, not a reaction. That's why it begins when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature natural law, and nature's God, God's law, entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This was a statement of position. This was not, since King George has been bad to us, we're going to be bad to him. This is not a reactionary document. This is a document built on position. In fact, it really take this understanding a little further, and we recognize the following, that the right of the people to ultimately claim interposition against a lawless government rests on the Declaration. Why? This is what the Declaration says. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, the ends that we just named, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Oh my gosh. And to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles, organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's a powerful paragraph. Whenever I hear the Declaration actually read in public around July 4, which it isn't done often, but when it is, I always wonder, I mean, that's amazing. That's politically incorrect language. That's very politically incorrect, because what it says is, if a government becomes actually destructive of the God-given rights named in the Declaration, that it is the right, it is the duty of the people, not in anarchy, not out of lawlessness, not simply by revolution, but it is their right to reclaim which rights that don't come from government. Unalienable rights that don't come to government, reclaim their natural rights and form a new government. Let me ask you this question. Isn't that what the colonists did?
But isn't that what the South did?
They did. They did. Yes. And the point is, I'm not negating everything in the South, okay? I'm just saying that that's another discussion exactly how they did that and everything else. But correct. And they claimed that very right. It was the new Declaration of Independence in 1861. And they had validity.
So in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln was reaffirming only half.
That's correct. I'm not condoning, just to plug this in, I have some admiration for much of Lincoln's rhetoric. I don't have a lot of admiration for much of what his executive power became during the Civil War. Most people are unaware of the fact that during the Civil War as well, I don't want to digress on this because there's a dangerous little rabbit trail that will eat up the rest of the afternoon and evening and tomorrow as well. And I've been in a lot of seminars on this, but the idea would be, most people are unaware that many of the national programs that are created outside the Constitution started during Lincoln's administration. So the thing is, we have to recognize the both, and it is a mixture. It's well stated that it is a mixture. You have to take both halves. Now, dealing back with this very point, reclaiming those natural rights, reclaiming those God-given rights, again, with the Declaration of Independence, that mainstay, that pillar remains. In short, if you remove the Declaration, it conveniently eliminates ultimate accountability. It leaves all questions merely as procedural, no longer philosophical. And it leaves everything to a technical interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution becomes an elastic, living document that just gets formed to whatever you need to, because you can read into it. Because even though you do have the Federalist Papers, you do have the Anti-Federalist Papers, and the debates that go on that to help elucidate it, but if you remove the ultimate foundation of the Constitution, you begin to cut its mooring to the true anchor which holds it, and then you begin to go into uncharted waters. Now, you should be able to understand the Constitution without just reading the Declaration if you read what the original intent is. But you don't understand the original intent of the founders, who had all of that reasoning in light of what document? The Declaration of Independence. Someone said to me and said, well, how come God then is never mentioned as a source of rights in the Constitution? Because they already mentioned it in the Declaration, and they're not redundant people. And how come this is not meant? Most philosophically, it was mentioned in the Declaration, and as we'll soon see, and I need to move right along quickly so you can see a little bit of it anyway, there are tremendous intermingling of the concepts between the Declaration and the Constitution throughout its text. Rights and fundamental law and procedure, security. The second point would be that the Declaration is like the foundation. The Constitution of the states and the rights of the people are in the middle, and the top would be the federal head. Now, the way this dealt with is following. If you look at it as bottom up, you'd say, what's the ultimate authority of the Declaration, the foundation? Okay, God. You have the God, immutable laws of nature, and nature's God. God gives those rights to people. People delegate some of that to government. That's the power flow. You can reverse it and look at the power flow the other direction as well. But the idea is, there you have that idea. The Declaration is the foundation upon which the Constitution sits. When you remove the foundation, what happens? Things begin to topple. Also, to recognize this, that the nature of, why do they think this way? Well, the nature of biblical law is this way. You have 10 fundamental laws in the Old Testament, and the founders were theologians. 53 out of the 55 that signed the Constitution were trained in their churches. So they understood this language. The Old Testament law rests on 10 fundamental laws. 4, your relationship to God. The next 6, your relationship to man. Those were called fundamental laws. Every other law in the Old Testament applies one of the 10 in equity to a specific case. We actually call it biblical case law, statute law. It applies one of the 10 commandments, whether it's stealing, theft, adultery, whatever it happens to be, for both its punishment. Now, the issue is that is not uncommon. It's the 10 commandments that's the charter of the nation. Then the bylaws are all these statutes and dealing with on due process, on how you protect that. This is not uncommon. If the Declaration stood alone, there would be no due process. That's why the Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, by the way, which was a phrase that meant property. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Those words are not accident. The government comes out of the consent of the governed, not the rule of the governed, that's democracy, but out of the consent of the government, governed, that is a republic. The charter then demands a bylaw. We could make this statement too, that the Declaration validates the Constitution. Or in other words, why it was written in the first place. Why did it even come to be? Representation in government is rooted in the equality of the individual. You would not have representation by population if people weren't equal. Well, where do we get people created equal? In the Declaration. Not externally equal. John Adams said, to think that people ought to be equal in their things, possessions, talents, or productivity is as absurd as any notion I can think of. Well, that ought to be plastered on television. You know? The idea is, no, equality meant equal before the law, equal in position, in rights, and before the law in due process. The Constitution rests on the assumptions stated in the Declaration that rights are God-given. The people can charter a new government. They validate this by writing a new Constitution. The structure of the Constitution assumes the premises of the universal principles, and the structure of the Constitution rests on these. Otherwise, you won't understand why there are constitutional clauses in their certain places. And that's why, of course, it says the ultimate appeal. One of the biggest principles in the Constitution that's ignored today is the principle of interposition. And I already mentioned it. When a lower magistrate resists a higher. The entire Constitution is structured in this way so a lower magistrate in a state could resist the national government. And the whole idea of a senator in Congress coming from your state, you know the original meaning of the senator, that's why he was elected by the state legislature initially. He was elected by the state legislature because he went to Washington to make sure the national government stayed out of the state's business. He was a guardian of state rights. You didn't mess with the Senate. Go ahead, enact your stupid laws funding everything under the sun in the House. It'll never get through the Senate. And the reason why it wouldn't get through the Senate is if there was one mandate from Washington to a state, the senator stood up like a statesman and said, not on my watch. Now, the hallmark of being a senator is bringing the bacon home. Getting as much federal funds to your state as possible. It's exactly the opposite of what a senator initially was designed to do by oath. Let me just finish this phrase and then we'll have, you guys are, I'm preaching to the choir anyway. All right, so the thing is, the idea of the following is that you look at this and you say, there's an ultimate appeal in the Declaration. You know it, for the support of this Declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledge to ourselves our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Pledge to each other. Well, then finally, let me make the final point here. Then the Constitution doesn't just, the Declaration doesn't just validate the Constitution. The Constitution, on the other hand, requires the Declaration. It was an eventual solution to the problems the U.S. had with England. And so we'd look at this. You'd say Parliament was attempting to rule outside its jurisdiction. So what did the Constitution do? Clearly define jurisdictions. Article 1, the legislature. Article 2, the president. Article 3, the Supreme Court. Article 4, the states' rights that shall not be infringed. You have every one of those articles. The whole structure of the Constitution was jurisdictional limits. The word jurisdiction in Latin, with its Latin root, means to speak in the only area you have authority to speak in. Speak the law, that is. You can talk about anything, but your authority comes out of that delegation. You have to know where you have authority and where you don't. And so it's very important. There was no supreme law in England. It was a government of men. Do you know, England had a parliamentary supremacy document. Whatever Parliament said was the law. You see, in America, we issued constitutional supremacy. Just because the legislature passes something doesn't mean it's law. Blackstone said it's null and void if it violates the laws of nature and of nature's God. And others said you could resist it. How could you resist it? Because individuals could resist the law all the way to the Supreme Court and overturn it in that case, and simply, as an example, you know what that was called at that time? You appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, swiftly and cheaply, all the way up, and then when the decision comes down and renders you resisting that law, which was not a law, the Congress, it's like a prophetic voice to the Congress. Wake up! Because what will happen with every other citizen? They'll do the same. So what does Congress normally do, or should have done, or did at least in the 1800s? They rescind that law. Because the law is going to be null and void when every individual realizes that and can appeal it. Now, this is the Constitution correcting the abuses that England had. That's why the Constitution was called the supreme law of the land, Article 6. There was no lawful way to resist tyranny in the British Constitution. So the Constitution instituted interposition. Article 4, Section 4, for instance, the Constitution, the United States guarantees to every state a republican form of government and shall protect each of them. How does the United States government protect individual states against invasion? Only on the application of the legislature or the executive if the legislature cannot be convened. So the national government is not supposed to enter a state for their own good, unless the governor, because the legislature has to prove the legislature couldn't be convened, invites them, or the legislature invites the national government in an area not already specified by the Constitution. Does that make sense? You can see this is interposition. In other words, the state has a right to say, sorry, not on our watch. And of course, it's happened recently in the last 20 years. We've had actual governors call out their own militia to the border of the state to keep the federal agents from getting off the tarmac of their airplane. And, you know, and of course there's all kinds of threats from Washington. Nobody wants any of these states to do this, but it's another digression. But there are states right now in our union that are catching glimpse. All these seminars, a lot of them have been doing across the country for years, are starting to catch on, evidently, because there are more and more people being elected to state legislatures that have some understanding of interposition. And states are starting to say, you know what? We're just not going to do that mandate. Can you imagine a state that simply says, you know, we're not going to follow that